following video and paper, entitled Darwinian Evolution Fails the 5 Standard Tests of a Scientific Hypothesis, shows us that, despite vehement denials from Darwinists to the contrary, Darwinian evolution does not even qualify as a real science in the first place, but is more realistically classified as an unfalsifiable pseudo-science. Darwin himself admitted that, "I am quite conscious that my speculations run quite beyond the bounds of true science." And he further conceded that what you hint at generally is very, very true, that my work is grievously hypothetical and large parts are by no means worthy of being called induction. More recently, Amir Lakatos stated that nobody to date has yet found a demarcation criterion according to which Darwin can be described as scientific. Karl Popper himself stated, "Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program." In the following quote, David Berlinski points out that Darwinian evolution simply offers none of the testability and precision that we're used to in other areas of science. In my honest opinion, the main reason out of the 5 reasons covered in the video and paper for why Darwinian evolution fails to qualify as a real science is because, unlike other overarching theories of science, Darwinian evolution does not have a rigid mathematical basis to experimentally test against. In fact, it might surprise some to learn that there's not a single mathematical equation to be found in Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species. In fact, Charles Darwin's main weakness in college was mathematics, and he even said that he found his work in college-level mathematics to be quote-unquote repugnant. More recently, leading mathematician Gregory Chaitin stated that it is a mathematical scandal that we do not have proof that Darwinian evolution works. The preceding paper also stated that, in fact, mathematics has consistently demonstrated that undirected Darwinian evolution does not work. And here's a paper from Dr. John Sanford that gets that point across. And here are a few more papers to further drive this point home. And here is a 2011 Oxford job description which stated, "Grand theories in physics are usually expressed in mathematics. Newton's mechanics and Einstein's theory of special relativity are essentially equations. Words are needed only to interpret the terms. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection has obstinately remained in words since 1859, and goes on to state, the mainstream of mathematical population geneticists since about 1964 has emphatically rejected the claim that fitness is maximized, and then goes on to state, mathematical population geneticists mainly deny that natural selection leads to optimization of any useful kind. And if you doubt that mainstream mathematical population geneticists mainly deny that natural selection leads to optimization of any useful kind, then just remember that many leading Darwinists, such as Dan Grauer and Larry Morin, because of the math of population genetics, insist that upwards to 90% of the genome must be junk. Of note, I hold Larry Morin's 10% estimate for deleterious mutations that he used in his calculation in the preceding paper to be far too conservative, and thus the percentage of junk DNA, according to his own calculation, should actually be much higher than his 90% estimate. As Dr. Michael Behe stated in the following paper, we had already known that the great majority of mutations that have a visible effect on an organism are deleterious. Now, surprisingly, it seems that even the great majority of helpful mutations degrade the genome to a greater or lesser extent. Moreover, as Dr. John Sefford shows in his book Genetic Entropy, the unselectable near-neutral mutation, which Dr. Morin had classified as perfectly neutral in his calculations, should, in reality, all be classified as slightly deleterious mutations that will build up over time instead of being classified as being perfectly neutral. In the following article, Dr. Sanford states it's almost universally acknowledged that beneficial mutations are rare compared to deleterious mutations. It appears that beneficial mutations may be too rare to actually allow the accurate measurement of how rare they are. This extreme rarity of beneficial mutations extends to studies of mutations in humans as well. In the following paper, Dr. Sanford states, yet such easily recognized deleterious mutations are just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of deleterious mutations will not display any clear phenotype at all. Thus, even though Dr. Morin used unrealistic estimates for deleterious mutations in his calculation, Dr. Morin was still only able to calculate that 10% of the genome may be functional. Moreover, these leading Darwinists insisted that most of the genome must be junk in spite of overwhelming empirical evidence to the contrary from ENCODE and from other sources. And they also held it to be mostly junk in spite of the fact that DNA is now known to be, by far, the most efficient information storage device known to man. Indeed, all of biology is turning out to be, contrary to Darwinian expectations, optimized in a way that is more perfect than we imagine. William Bialek states, scientists have identified and mathematically anatomized an array of cases where optimization has left its fastidious mark among them. In each instance, biophysicists have calculated the system can get faster, more sensitive, or more efficient without first relocating to an alternate universe with alternate physical constants. I hate to break it to Larry Morin and Dan Grauer, but in empirical science, evidence trumps theory all the time. As Richard Feynman stated, if it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't matter how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. The primary reason why Darwinian evolution does not have and can never have a rigid mathematical basis to test against, as other overarching theories of science have, is because there simply is no known law of evolution within the physical universe for Darwinists to build a rigid mathematical basis upon. As Ernst Mayr himself stated, in biology, as several other people have shown, and I totally agree with them, there are no natural laws in biology corresponding to the natural laws of the physical sciences. In fact, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, a law with great explanatory power in science, almost directly contradicts the primary Darwinian claim that greater and greater levels of functional complexity can easily be had and or naturally selected for over long periods of time. Indeed, entropy's main claim is that over long periods of time, everything in the universe will decay into simpler and simpler states until what is termed thermodynamic equilibrium is finally reached. As the following video and papers show, entropy is a far greater problem for Darwinists than they are willing to openly admit in public. But exactly how did Darwinian evolution ever become such a supposedly powerful scientific theory in the first place, without any rigid mathematical basis based on some known physical law? As the following site notes, it is numbers and mathematical formula that distinguish true science from hocus pocus. Indeed, mathematics is the backbone of all science, engineering, and technology. And yet, despite mathematics being the backbone of all science, engineering, and technology, Darwinian evolution, as has now been shown, simply has no real mathematical basis in science. Thus, the question now becomes, what is it exactly that gives such force to the arguments for Darwinian evolution, since it has no real mathematical basis in science? And in my honest opinion, the force of Darwinian arguments come from two primary sources. Those two primary sources are unrestrained imagination and bad liberal theology. As to the element of unrestrained imagination, in Darwinian evolution, instead of a person ever receiving any compelling evidence from Darwinists for why a particular facet of life came to be as it is, we are instead treated to an almost endless litany of imaginary just-so stories. As Michael Behe has observed, some evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins have fertile imaginations. Given a starting point, they almost always can spin a story to get to any biological structure you wish. Stephen Jay Gould himself stated that when Darwinists tried to explain form and behavior by reconstructing history and assessing current utility, they also tell just so stories, and the agent is natural selection. Virtuosity in invention replaces testability as the criterion for acceptance. Here are a few more references to drive this just so story point home. And here's a fitting quote from Adam Sedgwick, which he wrote in a letter to Charles Darwin himself. Sedgwick stated, "You have deserted after a start in that tramrod of all solid physical truth, the true method of induction, and started us in a machinery as wild, I think, as Bishop Wilkins' locomotive that was to sail with us to the moon." And then went on to tell Darwin that he had issued truths that were not likely ever to be found anywhere but in the fertile womb of man's imagination. For example, of being found in the fertile womb of man's imagination, oftentimes Darwinists will line up fossils into misleading sequences, such as the horse sequence, the whale sequence, or the ape-to-man sequence, to go along with their just-so stories that give us the false impression that one fossil evolved into another fossil in the sequence, which then evolved into another fossil in the sequence. Yet, as Henry G., the editor of Nature, pointed out, no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. That and the scarcity of fossils means that it is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way. To take a line of fossils and claim they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Henry G. went on to state this about the misleading ape-to-man lineup. We have all seen the canonical parades of apes, each one becoming more human. We know that, as a depiction of evolution, this lineup is tosh, nonsense. Yet we cling to it. Ideas of what human evolution ought to have been like still color our debates. And one can see the artistic license that Darwinists exercise for human evolution being played out on the falling site, in which 4 artists drew completely different drawings of the same exact fossil. And one can also see the artistic license for human evolution being played out on the falling site, where the white of the eyes, a uniquely human characteristic, was brought in very early on in the artist's reconstruction to make the fossils appear much more human than they actually were, even though the artist making the reconstruction clearly can have no real clue whatsoever as to what the color of the eyes or other features of these supposedly transitional fossils actually look like. Ernest A. Houghton, a physical anthropologist from Harvard University, stated that alleged restoration of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public. In fact, if one steps away from Darwinian storytelling and their misleading fossil lineups, then one finds that the fossils themselves tell us a very different story than the one being promulgated by Darwinists. They tell us a story of top-down introduction of life forms at various points during the Earth's history, rather than a bottom-up arrival of different kinds of life forms. These following references and quotes from leading paleontologists get this point across. Much the same misleading evidence based on imagination is found in how Darwinists use phylogenetics. As these following references show, in order to make genetic sequences line up with their Darwinian presuppositions, many times Darwinists carefully pre-filter their data in order to arrive at their foreordained conclusion. In fact, according to a Darwinist, the laboratory work that gave us the fraudulent 98.5% human-chimp genetic similarity number was so bad that it, quote-unquote, needs to be treated like nuclear waste. Bury it safely and forget about it for 1,000,000 years. Yet, in spite of how badly some Darwinists may massage genetic data to line up with their presuppositions, the real evidence still somehow manages to come shining through and refuses to cooperate with their attempts to manipulate the data. Here are a few references that drive this point home. Cladistic analysis is also another area that is often abused by Darwinists to create fraudulent props for their imaginary storytelling. Here are a few references on that. As well, Jonathan Wells covers some of these and many other fraudulent props used for Darwinian storytelling in his book Icons of Evolution, and also covers them in his recent subsequent book entitled Zombie Science. The overall point to all of this being that Darwinists will many times bend and contort the evidence so as to serve as misleading props for their storytelling. But in spite of how strongly some Darwinists may feel this type of storytelling with misleading props is compelling evidence for their theory, the fact of the matter is that it is nothing of the sort. In fact, it is either self-deception or just plain outright deception on their part. But the problem with imagination for Darwinists is not to be limited to they're just so stories and false props. In fact, the problem of imagination for Darwinists gets much, much worse. For example, if Darwinian evolution were actually true, then your beliefs that you really exist as a real person and that your perceptions of reality are trustworthy and that you have free will all become imaginary. In what I consider to be a shining example of poetic justice. In their claim that God does not really exist as a real person, but is merely an illusion, the atheistic naturalist and Darwinist also end up claiming that he himself does not really exist as a real person, but that he is merely a neuronal illusion. Here's a few references to drive this point home. The claim from Darwinists that they are not really real persons but are merely neuronal illusions is particularly interesting, since the fact that we really exist as real people is the most sure thing that we can possibly know about reality. What else is interesting in their denial that they are real persons is that the denial of the legal status of personhood has in fact underwrote some of the worst atrocities that have ever been committed by Western societies. For instance, both the Jews in Nazi Germany and babies in their mother's womb in present-day America are denied the legal status of personhood. Moreover, although reliable observation of reality is a necessary cornerstone of the scientific method itself, the reductive materialistic foundation that Darwinian evolution rests upon undermines this necessary cornerstone. That is to say, given the materialistic premises of Darwinian evolution, our perceptions and or observations of reality itself are held to be untrustworthy and therefore illusory. Richard Dawkins put the awkward situation between Darwinian evolution and reliable observation like this in this quote. In the following video and article, Donald Hoffman has, through numerous computer simulations of population genetics, proved that if Darwinian evolution were actually true, then all of our perceptions of reality would be illusory. And although Hoffman tried to limit his results to just our visual perceptions, as Alvin Plantinga pointed out years before Hoffman came along, there is no reason why the results of Darwinian evolution do not also extend to undermining our cognitive faculties as well. Thus, and what should be needless to say, a worldview that undermines the scientific method itself by holding all our observations of reality and all our cognitive faculties are illusory, is it not a worldview that can ever be firmly grounded within the scientific method. Moreover, completely contrary to what Hoffman found for Darwinian theory, it turns out that accurate perception and or conscious observation, far from being unreliable and illusory, is experimentally found to be far more integral to reality, far more reliable of reality than the math of population genetics had predicted. In the following experiment, it was found that reality doesn't exist without an observer. Apparently, science itself could care less if atheists are forced to believe, because of the mathematics of population genetics, that their observations of reality are illusory. Moreover, if Darwinian evolution were actually true, then free will itself also becomes illusory. Here are a few more notes along this line. Myself, I personally choose to accept the more than reasonable conclusion that agent causality is true, rather than wind up in catastrophic epistemological failure as Darwinists are forced into. Moreover, although Darwinists, against all common sense, may deny they have free will, the fact of the matter is that free will, like conscious observation, is now found to be an integral part of quantum mechanics. Here are a few references that get that point across. Thus, once again, experimental science itself could apparently care less if Darwinists, because of their underlying philosophical bias, are forced to believe they have no free will. Thus, basically, without God, everything within the Darwinian worldview, supposed evidence for Darwinian evolution, observations of reality, beliefs about reality, beliefs that you really exist as a real person, beliefs that you have free will, even beliefs about reality itself, everything collapses into self-refuting, unrestrained flights of fantasy and imagination. It would be hard to fathom a more unscientific worldview than Darwinian evolution and atheistic materialism in general have turned out to be. As mentioned previously, the one thing besides unrestrained imagination that gives force to Darwinian arguments is bad liberal theology. First off, in making this point clear, it is important to note that Christian presuppositions about the rational intelligibility of the universe and the ability of our mind to comprehend that intelligibility of the universe underlay the founding of modern science itself, and that those theistic presuppositions continue to be very much an integral part of the success of modern science. The main point I'm trying to make clear is that all of science, even Darwinian evolution itself, is dependent on basic theistic presuppositions about the rational intelligibility of the universe and the ability of our minds to comprehend that rational intelligibility. Science is simply impossible without those basic theistic presuppositions. But where Darwinian evolution goes off the rails, theologically speaking, as far as science itself is concerned, is that it uses bad liberal theology to try to establish the legitimacy of its atheistic claims, all the while forgetting that it itself, in order to stay scientific, is absolutely dependent on basic theistic presuppositions about the rational intelligibility of the universe and the ability of our minds to comprehend that. In establishing the fact that Darwinists used bad liberal theology to try to establish their science, it is interesting to point out that Charles Darwin's degree was in liberal theology and was not in mathematics nor in any other field that would be considered essential for founding a brand new branch of science. In fact, the liberal unscientific Anglican clergy of Darwin's day were very eager to jump on the Darwinian bandwagon from the beginning, while the conservative scientific clergy reacted against Darwin's theory. And Pastor Joe Boot and Dr. Cornelius Hunter have both done work exposing the faulty liberal theology that underlays Darwinian thought. Moreover, to further drive this point home, Charles Darwin's book itself, Origin of Species, instead of being filled with experimentation and or mathematics, is replete with bad liberal theology. And still to this day, after all these years, leading Darwinists are still very much dependent on bad liberal theology instead of on any compelling scientific evidence in order to try to make their case for Darwinian evolution. Here are a few references to get that point across. That Darwinists would still today be so dependent on such a faulty theological foundation based in bad liberal theology in order to try to give force to their arguments is, contrary to what Darwinists may believe, actually another compelling argument that drives my point home. That point being that basic theistic presuppositions are necessary for us to even be able to coherently practice science in the first place. One final note. Since Christianity was necessary for the founding of modern science, then it should not be all that surprising to find out that Christianity also brings us what can be termed an ultimate closure to science, in that Christ's resurrection from the dead provides us an empirically backed reconciliation between quantum mechanics and general relativity into what is called the quote-unquote theory of everything. Well, that's the end of the video. And again, I remind viewers that all papers and videos referenced in this video may be accessed in the link provided in the video description. Thanks again for watching.